Hello guys, welcome back. This is Adam, and in this episode of Azure Fundamentals, we're covering one of the most important processes when starting with the cloud, which is cloud adoption, and how Microsoft helps us on this journey. Stay tuned. Today we will learn about Cloud Adoption Framework in the context of Azure platform. As part of this exam and this episode, you should be able to understand and describe the key elements of Cloud Adoption Framework and how does it help with the adoption process itself. Before we move to the framework itself, let's start with what cloud adoption is. Cloud adoption is simply a strategic move by your organization, your company, in order to leverage cloud in their current business. And this is done simply because cloud has a lot of things to offer to accelerate your business and allow you to innovate and build solutions faster, therefore provide more value to your customers. And Cloud Adoption Framework is a set of tools, best practices, guidelines, and documentation created by Microsoft to help companies like yours with this journey. This framework is what I will be focusing on today. But please know that I spent over 40 hours trying to compress this very lengthy, very complex process into high-level overview. So sometimes I might oversimplify some topics, but if any topic will pique your interest during this episode, feel free to dive into the details. I will include a lot of links in the video description and on my website. That said, let's start with the framework itself. Cloud Adoption Framework is divided into stages, and the first stage that we'll look at today is called strategy. Strategy is simply building organizational alignment for moving to the cloud, to begin the cloud adoption. The first step in the strategy is called motivations. During this step, you want to answer the question, why move? As such, you want to meet with your key stakeholders and executives in your company to document what are the motivations behind the cloud adoption. And to do that, you need to understand what are your motivation triggers. The most common motivation triggers are either migration triggers, so moving your current infrastructure to the cloud so that you can gain some cost savings, you can reduce the complexity of your current infrastructure, maybe you want to optimize your current operations or increase business agility by having more flexible approach to managing infrastructure. Another motivation trigger is called innovation. In this category, you want to leverage the cloud and its features to provide some improvements to your company. For example, maybe reaching a global scale or improving customer experience. Maybe you want to disrupt new markets or create new products and services. All of those are easier to do if you start using the cloud with all of its features. Of course, it is up to you to decide which kind of features would be useful to you, your products, and your customers. Once we understand why move, the next thing that you need to do is so-called business outcomes. In the business outcomes, you want to answer the question, what to measure. So what would be your criteria of success that would support your move to the cloud? And this measure has to be a defined, concise, observable outcome for your company. Typical things might include an increase in revenue and profit, or a cost reduction, or maybe something more business-oriented like having a global access and reaching new markets. But it is important that this measure can be calculated and can be observed so that you can define it and track it. In this process, you will want to meet with your business leaders from the finance, IT infrastructure, and application groups. When we know what to measure and why do we move to the cloud, next thing is business justification. During this step, we need to understand what is my return of investment, because your company is there to make money, and it is important to track it, and this is what this step is all about. As part of the business justification, you will want to develop a business case that will create a financial model that supports both motivations and the outcomes. So this business justification will use the input from the two previous steps. There are many tools provided by Microsoft that supports you in the process of building this financial model. For example, a person like a chief financial officer in your company might want to use Azure TCO, which stands for Total Cost of Ownership Calculator, to calculate the cost of your current on-premise infrastructure. With Azure Pricing Calculator, you can estimate the monthly cost of Azure infrastructure. And once you start deploying things to Azure, Azure Cost Management will give you a full visibility on the existing resources and their cost. Those free tools that you see here will be covered in more detail in future episodes, but this might be a question on the exam, so make sure to remember that those are the key elements used in the business justification phase. And lastly, as part of this strategy, we want to decide on the first project. This first project will help you align your motivations and technical efforts. And to choose the right first project, you need to follow two criteria. First criteria is so-called business criteria. In here, you want to find a project that is first of all currently operating, so the project that is currently working in your company and has dedicated owner. But this is very important that this owner and this application has a strong motivation to move to the cloud because it sees its benefits. This is important because the engagement of the owner will be very important across every single step of the process. And additionally, there are technical criteria. You want to find a project that has minimum amount of dependencies and assets. This is because if you choose a project that is too big, it will take you too long to validate your strategy. In summary, our first stage strategy is about defining business justification and the outcomes. Once this stage is completed, we move to the planning phase. In the planning phase, there are again few steps that we need to follow. The first step is digital estate. This is so-called inventory of assets. You want to review what you currently have in your company and what you should do with it. And that decision, that rationalization, is so-called decided based on this 5 R's of rationalization rule. So for each digital asset that you will find in your company, you want to assign 1 R. First, we have rehost. Rehost means that we take existing application and we move it to the cloud without any changes. This typically means move existing applications into infrastructure as a service, so deploy this into virtual machine or a container. Another R is for refactor. So you want to make a small changes to your existing application code base in order to fit it into existing platform as a service offerings in Azure. For example, if you have a web application running on a virtual machine and this web application uses SQL Server, maybe with a little bit changes in your code, you can fit it to Azure App Service and Azure SQL to take advantage of the platform as a service offering in Azure. Another option is called re-architect. For the re-architect, you will need to make complex changes to your code base. This is used if you want to introduce new services in your application. For example, you might see that a Key Vault is very good service in Azure and you want to introduce it in your application. Therefore, you might want to re-architect existing ones to take advantage of those security services in Azure. But another reason for re-architecture is when your application strongly depends on the physical infrastructure in your company, so it is incompatible with the cloud. So in short, you use re-architect to implement new features or fix incompatible applications. Another one is rebuild. For this rationale, we create applications from scratch. This could be also called new. So we look at existing application, we see that effort of introducing this in the cloud is too big, or maybe the code is too old, and we decide to rebuild this from scratch to take full advantage of what cloud has to offer. And the last one is called replace. In replace, you want to look at every single application that you have and see what cloud has to offer already. Maybe not only Azure, but Office 365 has a lot of software as a service offerings. Maybe there's offering that completely replaces the functionality that your current application provides, in which case you might want to drop the current application and take this software as a service offering. So basically, in your company, go through every project that you have, assign one of those R's for every project that you can, and then create a plan out of this. Next step is initial organization alignment. During this, when the plan is being established, you want to meet with the key stakeholders in your organization to make sure that everyone is aligned and every key person supports this adoption plan. During this step, the alignment of people who will make this plan a reality is very important. It is also a step where you map your people to the capabilities, so you know who should be engaged when. And once your organization is aligned, you will create skills readiness plan. During this stage, you want to review your current skill sets in your company and create a plan that will address the gaps, because in the cloud, you will need to have a lot of new skills in your company across different teams and different people, and this plan will take care of that. And once you do all those things, simply put it into so-called cloud adoption plan. This plan will be used to manage the change across your digital estate, skills, and the organization and the processes. To summarize, in the planning stage, we want to create actionable plan for our cloud adoption. From there, we move to the next stage, called ready. So readiness stage is all about preparing your first Azure environment. To do that, you start with Azure Setup Guide. So you read Azure documentation on how the initial environment should look like. You want to become familiar with the tools and approaches that will help you create this first Azure environment. Also at this stage, you will want to choose which type of Azure subscription should you use and which is the best for your company. And once you have everything prepared, you start creating your first Azure environment. This is so-called Azure Landing Zone. This will be your first Azure environment. It will be completely created out of Microsoft guidelines, and it will allow you to set up a code base for future improvements. And advice here is to use infrastructure as a code approach so that everything can be later changed, expanded, updated, but everything will be consistent and very easy to redeploy if needed. And once the landing zone is created, you want to extend it even further to match your organizational needs and allow for the smooth cloud transition. One important thing is that, and this will be shown across this entire process and a lot of places in Cloud Adoption Framework, is as you go through those stages, always check the best practices. You just want to be sure that this initial landing zone and the expansion goes according to the best practices, because later on it's very hard to change things if you will create bad platform architecture. To summarize the ready stage, we want to prepare Azure environment. Since we have the plan to adopt the cloud, our next step is adopt. Because all our previous stages were preparing us to move to the cloud, adopt is where we start doing that. In the adoption, we again have few steps. But adoption splits into two separate streams. One is called migrate. When we were talking about motivations, one of the most common motivation triggers was migrations. And this is why adoption is also split into migrations and innovations. The first step that you want to do in this stage is do your first migration. During this step, you want to migrate your first project to the cloud. This is so that you can read all the guides that Microsoft prepare for the migration paths. You want to familiarize yourself with the native tools and approaches in Azure that will help you to do that migration. But the important part here is not only the migration, but also the learning curve. Because after this first migration, you need to familiarize yourself with the migration scenarios. When moving to the cloud, you will see that there's plenty of different scenarios, different workloads that needs to be migrated. For example, migrating virtual machines is completely different from migrating data services or maybe web applications. Microsoft has plenty guides that are available for you to use during this process, so you need to familiarize yourself with those and prepare migration scenarios for your own company. Just like with the previous step, remember to also check best practices, because migrating is one thing, but also setting everything up is another. So make sure that your architectural decision will follow the best practices for each tool that you decided to use in the tool chain. Because all those tools and decisions that you make will accelerate other migrations in your own company. That's why it's so important. And lastly, remember about process improvements. Migration is very process-heavy activity, so it will take a very long time to migrate everything to the cloud. Therefore, being able to evaluate how your current migration is going, what are the things that should be improved, is a very important aspect of this process. And besides migration, you also have innovation. In the innovation part of the adoption process, you want to make so-called business value consensus. So it's a decision that you need to make on a technical solution and identify a hypothetical customer need and map it to a business value that you can provide by building this solution. And then match it and map that value to your cloud strategy. Once you map this value to a strategy, the next part is the innovation guide. In the innovation guide, you will decide on the tools that are available in the cloud to accelerate development of this solution and build this minimum valuable product, MVP. Similarly to migration, remember about best practices, because your architectural decisions should follow them, because they will be your solid foundation for the other applications. Again, similarly to migration, remember about process improvements. You want to go through each iteration where you create this application to make sure that your customers and your teams provide feedback. In Azure, there's a lot of tools like Azure DevOps or GitHub, which help you with these processes. In summary, adopt stage is about implementing existing plan and either migrating or innovating, or maybe both. One thing that I want to note here is that those three stages, plan, ready, and adopt, are the key stages that define the cloud adoption according to Cloud Adoption Framework. So if there will be a question during the exam, what are the three main stages that the cloud adoption helps with, are those three, because all of the other stages that we'll be talking about are the supporting processes and supporting stages for this entire framework. Speaking of which, the next two processes that we need to talk about are governance and management. And those processes span across all those three stages, because regardless of what is your current stage, you need to start to govern and manage your environment from the earliest stages until the very end. For the governance and management part, there are two main things that you need to do. First of all, you need to define what are the governance solutions. But for the solutions here, remember about three important things. First of all, the solutions that you decide needs to meet your business needs. But at the same time, they need to provide the agility so that you can easily adopt the cloud. You don't want to constrain yourself. But while providing the agility, the most important part here is you need to control the risks. So you need to make sure that your environment will stay compliant and stay secure at all times. And once the solutions are defined and the platform is ready, you can hand it over to cloud operations, whose responsibilities are to provide the stability and manage the cost of the platform. This is very important because those two need to work together, because you want your environment to be stable, but also you want to control the costs, because you want to meet your business commitments as part of your financial model. So in summary, governance is about making sure that your environment stay compliant, it will be controlled and secure, whereas management is about ongoing operation and optimizations of your current environment. But I want to talk about one more thing here, which is called organize. It's not a stage per se, but it is an alignment that needs to go across this entire process. So you need to be sure that across this entire process, people will have assigned roles and responsibilities. This is because this entire cloud adoption framework will involve a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of teams. So you need to make sure that everyone knows what to do. One of the ways to achieve that is to create this RICI matrix, which stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed, so that every team knows what to do and when during this entire process. In the documentation for Cloud Adoption Framework, every single step is laid out very nicely. You can scroll through this documentation to find this life cycle and this diagram that we've been talking about today. And notice that for every single stage on this diagram, you will find a section on the left-hand side, which goes from the overview, giving you a high-level overview of the current stage, and then goes through each single point that is required for you to do. There's plenty of links, plenty of guidelines, and references to reference architectures for Azure to help you with this adoption process. Remember that this is a living document, so it will be constantly changing. As soon as you will start adopting the cloud for your company, definitely go back to this document and check it again. To summarize, Cloud Adoption Framework is a set of tools, best practices, guidelines, and documentation prepared by Microsoft to help customers with the cloud adoption process in the context of Azure platform. This framework is divided into multiple stages. The first stage is called strategy. During this stage, you want to understand why you want to move to the cloud and how do you provide the business value from that move. Then you move to the planning phase, where you prepare actionable plan based on your current digital assets in your company, so the current project base and current solution base in your company, but also this plan needs to support the current strategy. Next stage is called ready. In this stage, you prepare your Azure environment, so-called Azure landing zone, but you also want to prepare and align both users and processes in order to start adopting the cloud, because your next stage is adopt. This is the point where you start adopting moving to the cloud and either migrate, innovate, or both. But make sure to do it based on existing plan. So this is simply an implementation of existing plan created in the previous stage. As those three stages, plan, ready, and adopt, are happening, make sure to govern your Azure environment. So align compliance and security standards, but also the tools that will support you in this process. But at the same time, make sure to manage your environment. So manage, monitor, but also optimize the environment when it comes to stability, but also cost. And the organized part is not a stage per se, but make sure that everyone knows what to do and when to do it. One of the best ways to implement that is using ACI matrix. One thing that I didn't mention because it would have to be on every single slide and every single point is that documentation and proper communication of every single stage here is critical requirement for this process. So make sure that as you move along, everyone knows what to do and everything is very well documented. Lastly, as I mentioned, Microsoft Documentation for Cloud Adoption Framework is a living document. That means it will be constantly changing. Therefore, if you are going through the cloud adoption process in your company, at every stage, every now and then, make sure to go back there and check if anything has been changed. Most of the time, the changes are not because something was bad, but because there were new good practices that were found or maybe new tools that will support you even further. So it is only advantageous for you to check it out. All the materials for this episode can be found on episode 33 on my website. But please remember that this episode is just an essence of what cloud adoption really is. There's plenty more to learn, so if your company is migrating to the cloud, definitely check the available documentation and available tools. If you like my work, if you like those tutorials, support the channel by subscribing. And as always, see you in the next one.